for several nuclear weapons, and was at the point where if something wasn't done to halt and reverse that process, they were a couple of months away from accumulating enough of a uranium stockpile that they could produce a nuclear weapon. That was the core issue. Now, did some people hope that as a function of doing this nuclear diplomacy with Iran, you would get to the point that maybe you could also work together on other issues like Syria and Yemen? Sure. And I, to be honest, don't have any problem with that hope, given that what we've been trying for a couple of decades hasn't been working. If that would be a function of this, great. But that wasn't the reason for the deal. The deal was about stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And in that sense, it worked. It reversed Iran's capacity and moved them, more than a year away from accumulating enough LEU to be able to produce a nuclear weapon, and bought an enormous amount of time. So I just want to be clear that it wasn't about that if you conclude after that that somehow relations with Iran didn't transform and Iranian regional policy didn't change, that meant that the deal didn't work. No, that wasn't the point of the deal.
Well, I take that point, that Iran was making significant advances and that the deal had merit in thwarting that. But I should have said people also hoped, and certainly that's been picked up by critics.
And the reason I make that point, first I think it's fundamental to understanding, but related to this issue of Iranian meddling in the region, the question often comes up, well, why didn't we insist on that too, right? Why naively just do the nuclear deal? And this has been a core Trump administration critic of the deal. It didn't constrain Iranian activities in the region. I would just say to that, look, it was hard enough to get this deal. It required an international coalition of very tough sanctions that we only got those other countries to agree to because of the concerns about the nuclear program. If we had then said to the Iranians after 2 years of difficult negotiations, oh, by the way, it's good we negotiated the nuclear thing, but now we actually can't conclude this deal until you get completely out of Syria and Yemen and Lebanon and completely reverse your foreign policy in the region. Don't get me wrong, those are admirable goals. I share all of those goals. But the idea that we could have gotten that as well is absurd. And therefore, by insisting on that, we would have had neither. We would have neither the capacity to contain Iran in the region or a nuclear deal. So that's why it wasn't in the first place, and that's why we need, to answer your question, other means to deal with the Iranian problematic behavior in the region. That's my core critique of the Trump approach on Iran. By trying to accomplish, as I understand it, the current policy is maximum pressure on Iran unless it agrees to a much better nuclear deal that lasts forever, has no enrichment, covers ballistic missiles, has inspectors go wherever they want, and also changes its behavior throughout the region. If that is, we're getting back to our debate about results, if that ends up being the result of this policy by the end of 4 or 8 years, I will be the first to applaud it. But I think it's unlikely. And therefore, by trying to accomplish everything, it's really our policy to have maximum pressure on Iran until it does all of those things and gets out of Yemen to boot. Because if that's the policy and we try to get everything in that sense, I think we're going to end up with nothing, and that's a real problem.
I'd just like to ask Rich, our chairman, if he wants to comment on this question of the Iranian nuclear agreement, as he was our ambassador in Oman.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Obviously, our colleagues, especially our colleagues who are also in government, are very familiar with the process. I happened to be in Oman when we started the process. And I guess I agree with much of actually what both of you are saying. It is absolutely true that at the time it was of critical importance to stop the Iran uranium program. So that had to be the top priority. Obviously, everyone would have liked to have gotten more, but I think that the more could not be a reason for not going through with the deal. The deal, or the process of getting to the deal, did have some positive other impacts. For example, I mean, it's true, Mike, you can criticize the amount of time that our diplomats spent with the Iranians, but it did in fact actually lead to better perceptions or understandings of each other's positions. So whereas before, without any communication, I think there were a lot of misconceptions, at least what I saw in my part in the effort in Oman. It at least cleared up some of the misperceptions. Now, in terms of the hope that it would have other impacts, Tom, I think you're right. There was a hope that, and I think, Phil, you echoed this as well, there was a hope that we needed to solve the nuclear issue, but potentially there would be other positive outcomes. And I think there was a kind of a specific idea that, and I think it was Phil who mentioned, one of the things we did do, or that did happen during the Obama administration, was a pretty direct communication to Iran that we were no longer pursuing a policy of regime change. And I think the purpose in sending that signal was to sort of clear the air in terms of our ability to talk to the Iranians. And then the other element that I think was at least behind the thinking, and Phil, you'd know better than I because you were closer to the policy-making point, was that by eliminating the idea that we're seeking to overturn the regime no longer had us as their boogeyman with their own people to try to keep their people aligned against us. And so one of the expected or hoped for outcomes was that the Iranian people would become an ally of ours in order to try to change Iranian behavior. And I think we saw some evidence of that with some of the comments or some of the things coming out of the Iranian people who were arguing that the dividends that the Iranians received from the reduced sanctions be spent in Iran and not in its proxy wars in the region. So there was a hope that kind of support would help us in terms of our approach to the region. The final thing I would just say is that we have not found a way to really counter Iranian malign behavior in the region. But please do be aware we are doing a lot that is unseen and unreported to counter malign Iranian behavior in the region. It's just that we have not really been able to do enough to stop them. But even from my perspective in Oman, you could see a lot was going on that is not something that can be reported. So we are aware of and making efforts against Iranian malign behavior, but we're far from being able to actually solve that problem.
Well, there are military sales to allies to allow them to defend themselves against any potential Iranian aggression. There are counterintelligence cooperation for the same purpose. We're working with our partners and friends and allies in the region, but some of them are not satisfied with other strategies that we're pursuing in the region, and they weren't satisfied with the Obama administration's failure to get more deeply involved at an earlier point, which might have been more successful in thwarting Iran and Russia. But now let's assess what Trump is doing. Is the withdrawal of 2,000 special forces, let's say they're not sufficient to contain Iran and Russia in Syria, but are they necessary in conjunction with other efforts like stabilization? And if we do take them out and don't spend money stabilizing, then can we trust Turkey to contain Iran and Russia?
Our troops weren't there and don't have legal authorization to be there to push back on Iran and Russia. I mean, if Congress wants to declare war and deploy troops there, you can do it, but legally, that was not their purpose, and it's not. And I think that's not absent a different legal framework, not a useful approach to take. But here's something really important. The future of Syria is going to be decided in negotiations that largely haven't happened yet. And if part of those negotiations were the United States talking about the circumstances under which U.S. troops would leave. The U.S. would have a serious voice in those discussions. But we devastated, destroyed any negotiating leverage we had by announcing, before we'd even thought through the implications, that we're going to summarily withdraw all of our troops. I don't know what leverage anybody thinks we have to have any influence in those discussions. I'm not arguing that we should remain in Syria indefinitely. But I am arguing that as a matter of diplomacy and national security, we have an interest in what Syria looks like. And what Mike described as a process error of, well, it would have been nice if we had the NSC study before the presidential tweet. It would have been nice if we had a diplomatic strategy we were executing and the presidential tweets were actually integrated with a diplomatic strategy to advance American national security interests, which are both in getting our troops out of Syria and in ensuring that what's left behind in Syria is better for Americans than what is likely to happen otherwise. And instead, because of the process error, we completely undermined our negotiating leverage and made things much worse, not just for our Syrian Kurdish allies, but for Americans and American allies who care about the future of stability and security in the Middle East.
We retain significant leverage in Syria. Number one, our ally Israel is conducting now even more robust attacks in Syria. And it is demonstrating to the regime and to the Russians that it has the military capability to shake the regime to its core. And the only way that the Russians and the Iranians can get that to stop is by going through Washington. The regime cannot retake Idlib without going through Turkish forces, which have an American backstop. We saw that last August when the Russians and the regime and the Iranians started organizing for an assault on Idlib, and the president tweeted that this would be a mistake, and the Turks put their forces on alert, and we stopped it there. So they can't. They need Idlib in order to stabilize Syria. They need the Israelis' consent to stop, and behind the Turks and behind the Israelis is the United States. What exactly is going to happen in eastern Syria is not yet clear. That's going to be part of a negotiation primarily between the United States, Turkey, and the YPG. I don't know to what extent the Russians will be able to insinuate themselves into that. But as that situation crystallizes more, we'll also have leverage. We'll also have leverage there. Exactly how we are reposturing is not clear to me when we pull those 2,000 troops out. For example, I've seen press reports, I haven't had them confirmed by anybody that can tell me, that we are significantly increasing our presence in Jordan. And so perhaps one could imagine on the basis of that, and I'm just extrapolating, I'm just speculating here, one could imagine that from, there was this base TUNF on the Syrian side of the Jordanian border. You could imagine it basically, figuratively speaking, moving to the south to the other side of the Jordanian border and continuing to block an Iranian land bridge from within Jordan. That's a huge speculation on my part. Don't know that the Jordanians want to play that role, but there's all kinds of ways. The United States is actually a very powerful country. And it has influence over all the major actors, especially on our side in the Syrian mix. So I don't think that we have given up all leverage over Syria by pulling those troops out. On the process, you have to, I have sympathy on the process error, if you want to call it that. I have much more sympathy for the president than I think John or Phil do, because the president told General Mattis from day one that he wanted to patch things up with the Turks, and General Mattis and Brett McGurk continued to build Rojava. And if you listen to Brett, if you listen to Brett McGurk on the Sunday shows, what's McGurk say he wants? McGurk says we should pull out, and we're going to pull out, but as we pull out, what we should do is we should get the regime, the Assad regime, to take over the Kurdish parts of of Syria. So, if anybody had any doubt in their mind that the YPG policy that we were following was part of an Obama policy of aligning with the Iranians across the board, just think of what McGurk was saying. These are the people we had in charge. The counter-ISIS network in the U.S. government, led by Brett McGurk, was entirely hostile to Turkey, entirely in favor of building up the Assad regime inside. It's the same mindset that said we don't have to worry about the Iranian trained and equipped and basically led popular mobilization units in Iraq because they're anti-ISIS in Iraq. We don't have to worry about the pro-Moscow, pro-Tehran proclivities, which are very deeply historically grounded, of the YPG when we align with it. That's the vision that they had. That's the vision that they had. They were building, again, whether they were making coffee or burning down the house, it doesn't matter. Objectively, our policies were leading to an Iranian land bridge from Tehran to Beirut.
Let me make a very brief comment.
Then I want to move to the topic that usually leads these discussions and things, you know.
It'll be very brief. I was actually going to let this one go because I very much agreed with John's comments, both on the substance and on the process, but two quick additions. On the process, Mike, it wasn't just Brett McGurk. It was the entire administration. We had a new Syria envoy, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who announced a quote-unquote new Syria policy and gave speeches to the effect that we were going to stay indefinitely to fight this mission. That was reinforced by the Secretary of State, by the Secretary of Defense, by the National Security Advisor, who said not only were they going to stay there for the ISIS mission, but for a counter-Iran mission. And he even said that after the President's tweet. So the idea that somehow the process was okay, the President was clear, and it was just this one guy holdover from the Obama administration that had a different view. I'm sorry. The process, you can't just say that the process was brilliant. It's just only the President knew about it, and every other top official was just not on the same page and was saying the wrong thing. That is the definition of a terrible process, and I think it has real consequences. And then the second point, just briefly, is I think this discussion of how we're going to make up for the troops goes back to the contradiction I highlighted at the beginning about being willing to do what's necessary on the ground and wanting to pull out. If the response to the pullout is, don't worry, we can still do these things because, as Trump said, we have bases elsewhere, like in Iraq, and Mike says maybe we'll put one in Jordan, then what's the purpose of the pullout? I mean, it's either one thing or another. ISIS is defeated and we can pull out because we don't want to do risks on the ground, or we're still in the region and we've got bases that we're going to keep the troops there necessary to intervene. But I don't see how it can be both.
Can I quickly?
Quickly.
Very quickly. The purpose of the pullout is to create the possibility of reaching a strategic accommodation with our NATO ally, Turkey. Forget about all the process argument. We were building a PKK statelet on the Turkish border that was going to ensure permanent enmity with the Turks. The President did the right thing for that reason.
Okay. I'm sorry, this conversation could go on, and we never really got to Yemen, but here's the subject that gets neglected now, the Palestinian-Israeli problem. Do any of you have any idea of what will be part of a promised Trump peace plan for the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and where does that fit into hierarchy of our concerns in the region? Is it something that still animates extremists and anti-Americanism? Or is it just not as vital right now as civil wars raging through the Arab world? What will be part of this plan if this plan is ever produced?
Say something, and then Mike knows what's in the plan. He'll tell everybody. So I didn't neglect it because I think it's important. Not because it's the central problem in the region or that solving it would somehow solve all of the other problems. It clearly wouldn't. We know that. But that doesn't mean it's not important. I mean, it's important not least for the people who live there. I think it's important for Israel for the reasons that American administrations of both parties has said for years, which is that if we want to see Israel be a secure, democratic Jewish state in the future, it needs to figure out a way to resolve this problem and not be ruling over millions of Palestinians, because it's hard to see how Israel remains all of those things while ruling over the Palestinians, and that's why American administrations have made efforts for years to try to resolve the problem. Like Mike, I'm hugely skeptical that we'll be able to do so. I almost think at this point it doesn't matter what's in the Trump plan. It would have been, even under the best of circumstances, the conditions on the ground are just not ripe for this ultimate deal, right? You have, on the Palestinian side, a president who is hugely unpopular, is in about the 13th year of his 5-year term, wouldn't have the authority to sell a deal even if you were able to agree to it, which he almost certainly wouldn't, not least because the Israelis have no intention of putting on the table anything remotely close to something that he could buy into. You have an Israeli cabinet at this point, more than half of which doesn't even believe in a two-state solution. So the idea that they're going to put one on the table that the Palestinians could agree to, whatever the Americans think, is just not going to happen. And so that's one reason it doesn't really matter what's in the plan. But the other reason it doesn't matter is, I hinted at in my opening remarks. We've done a set of other things that have led the Palestinians not even to be willing to talk to or engage with the United States. So I wouldn't hold my breath. It's not surprising it's been 2 years and the plan still hasn't come out yet. Now we wait for the Israeli elections, but then the administration will still have to think long and hard about whether it's willing to put forward a plan that would be dead on arrival, unless the only purpose of it would be to let the Israelis sort of semi-embrace it, have the Palestinians denounce it, and then that can be a further reason to blame them for the lack of progress, which I think is just unhelpful across the board.
Mike has said he wants to have the final word. It's true.
So that's so false. I very generously said I've been talking a lot. If you'd like to go before me, you can. Look at that. Look at that.
That's right.
So I'll give you the final word.
Do you? I'll talk. Okay. Let me just. I think to answer your question, I think governments have moved away from the centrality of the Arab-Israeli issue because they are more preoccupied with their own security, and particularly internal security, being something they worry about much more, and a sense that the Arab-Israeli stuff is old-style politics that don't really work anymore. I think for broad populations, the Arab-Israeli issue still is a prism through which people see injustice in the world, and I don't think that's gone away. I think I think broad populations still think that what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is a profound injustice. I think there are two reasons why we shouldn't just walk away. One is the possibility that there will be a serious eruption of violence which damages Israel and the Palestinians alike. I mean, we've seen several intifadas. It is not inconceivable that we would have an even larger eruption of violence. But it seems to me that the most important argument is what's the nature of Israel if it decides it never has to fix this issue? The nature of Israel changes. The nature of Israel as an ally of the United States changes. The nature of Israel in the world changes. There are too many Arabs who do not have citizenship. I'm not talking about Israeli Arabs. I'm talking about Arabs who don't have Israeli citizenship, who are under the control of Israeli authorities and whom they regard as an occupying power, that if that goes on and on and on, you have the problem of running an indefinite occupation and having a genuine apartheid state. That isn't the Israel that many Israelis want. That isn't the Israel that many friends of Israel want. And while there may not be perfect solutions to this, I think Israel has to look for a solution, and my strong preference would be to look for that solution before there's an eruption of violence that changes all the pieces on the board rather than after.
Oh, so you are going to get the last word.
It all depends on you. It all depends on you. You could always ask another question. This is my favorite. The Trump peace plan is the deal of the century. Is my favorite Arab-Israeli peace plan, Palestinian-Israeli peace plan, of all the ones that are out there, both from the United States and from other actors, because it's all drum roll and no plan. And I hope this drum roll continues all the way until the end of the first term. I mean, I feel that the president will probably have to unroll it at some point because he promised to do so during the election. I think he wants to keep his election promise. But I agree with Phil. There's no chance that we're going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Certainly not in this administration, and I think for a very long time. The two sides are too far apart. Mahmoud Abbas has no interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could go through all the reasons. But this issue, I saw it when I was working in the White House. It eats up an enormous amount of senior leader time and effort for all kinds of reasons, which I do not think are strategically justifiable. The focus of the United States should be countering the Iranian alliance system and putting together its own alliance that can help it stabilize the region. Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not going to help it in any significant way in doing that. There is one counter-argument to that, which someone put to me just recently, which is that one of the things that the administration is doing with its peace plan is working to bring the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Emiratis closer to the Israelis by means of this plan. That we should see it not so much as an effort to bring Mahmoud Abbas and Netanyahu to the table, but as a tool for building a closer alliance. You know, we have an alignment right now between Israel and those states that I mentioned, so that we could transform it into an actual kind of alliance, and we'd have much closer cooperation between the Israelis and the Saudis and so on. Interesting idea. I'm skeptical, just because I think the distance between the Saudis and the Israelis, for cultural, religious, historical reasons, and so on, is such that this is not going to, that even as they recognize the shared interests that they have in combating Iran and other interests, and even though that leads to a lot of de facto cooperation, it's not the Palestinian-Israeli question that is really keeping this from going to the next level. It's all of the historical differences between them. If I could be convinced that I'm wrong about that, then I might see this as a real positive step. Until I'm convinced of that, I want it to remain drum roll and no rollout.
Thank you. We're out of time, but please, on our website, you'll find the video of this conference within a day, www.mepc.org, and it will be published in the Journal, the next issue of the Journal. Thank you very much to the panelists for a great discussion, and thank you for coming.